Hey there! It's no big secret that the racing game genre is a bit lackluster right now, especially when it comes to sim racing. If you're a racing game player who's thinking of moving on to more serious genres of racing, there's definitely no shortage of sims available for you to play today. Excluding the ones that focus on specifics, such as the Rally or Assetto Corsa Competizione, the ones that I tend to see get recommended the most whenever PC players are asking for their first step into the sim racing genre are games such as iRacing, if you're rich, Project Cars 2, R-Factor 2, Automobilista, and of course Assetto Corsa, which is without a doubt the most recommended out of all of these. But this list makes me a little sad, because there's a game that I never ever see get recommended, not only in these lists, but just in general across the internet. It seems that this game has been forgotten by time, but why? How could we forget the game that revolutionized the racing genre? How could we forget GTR2? What happened to GTR2? Alright, so unlike my Gran Turismo 4 video, I'm going to actually tell you what GTR2 is, because there's a good chance this is your first time ever hearing its name to begin with. GTR2, the FIA GT racing game, was a racing sim developed by Simbin Studios. If you're wondering who Simbin are, they've since rebranded to Sector 3 Studios and are the guys behind Race Room Racing Experience. A very good game actually, I think it's extremely underrated, albeit it does have a questionable monetization scheme. And they're also, of course, the legendary studio behind Volvo, the game. The game, GTR2, not Volvo, was released in 2006, so it's a little dated, and it has had some fierce competition throughout the years. Even at the time of its launch, it was already competing with games such as R-Factor, which is considered legendary nowadays. But I'd say it still holds up in many ways which I will start to cover right now, actually. Starting with the graphics, which maybe might not be the best place to start with now that I actually think about it. But come on, dude. If you think graphics are still a reliable way of telling whether a game is good or not in the year 2023, then you're either mentally stuck in 2012 or you were born in 2012. The graphics are very clearly dated. It's not a 2023 game, nor is it Gran Turismo 4 for the PS2. But just because it's dated, it doesn't mean it looks bad. I would actually say this game has this weird mix where sometimes it looks very good and could pass as an early 2010s game, but other times it really shows its age. It really depends on the track and especially on who makes it. Because yes, this game has mods and we will talk about that later. Of course, not just talking about the tracks, the same thing can be said about cars. Although I think when it comes to the cars themselves, I think they all look very good, without any exception. It's not a weird mix of looking good and bad, they all have rather nice models and textures for the time. You're not gonna look at an M3 GTR for instance and say something like, I can't quite tell what that car is. Is that a Toyota Camry? And speaking of cars, I think we should move on to that next, because my reason for actually having decided to download and try this game to begin with was because of a car. We will return to the graphics later though when we talk about mods. So as you could probably tell from the title, this game depicts the FIA GT Championship, which was mostly a European racing championship. It did have some races in Asia and Africa, but very little. It was mostly European. But anyways, the FIA GT Championship was, to dumb it down, the predecessor to the current FIA GT series with GT3 and all that. Except the cars were way cooler. And sure, I may be a bit biased in favor of early 2000s cars, but some of these cars, especially the GT ones, fit more as Le Mans prototypes than GT cars. Cars like the Maserati MC12, Lister Storm, Celine S7R, bunch of Vipers, you know, these cars are just fucking cool, man. But if you don't want to drive around in these high-end cars, don't worry. You can be like me, who only bought this game because it has a Gilles Vertigo, aka my dream car, unironically. And also, yes, there are classes in this game, several of them actually. You of course have GT1, which at the time was just called GT. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, this game depicts both the 2003 and 2004 seasons of the GT Championship. But anyways, yeah, you have GT, which is the top class. This is where you find the real rocket ships, just insane cars. At G2, you've also got some pretty fucking crazy cars. This is where the cars that are really powerful, but not quite as powerful as the GT cars go. The performance gap between them isn't that big, honestly. Here you've got cars like the legendary M3 GTR, the Corvette, and even a few cool obscure cars like the Morgan Aero 8, or the absolutely crazy Seat Toledo GT. Further down you then have G3 and NGT, which I believe are basically the same class, except NGT is restricted to only being run on a few circuits. Do correct me if I'm wrong. It's actually very hard to find information on this racing series, and it honestly feels like some of the info I find online contradicts what I find on the game, and vice versa. And sometimes there's even websites that just contradict themselves. Anyways, these are the slowest cars. In an endurance race, they'd be the equivalent of GTE cars when compared to LMP2 or LMP1. You've got a few little neat cars like a Lotus Elise, a Viper, Gilles Vertigo, my beloved, a 350Z, and some Porsches. And the best thing about all of these cars, they're all really fun to drive, no matter the class. I don't know what it is about Simbin, but they always have this thing where you always feel really immersed when you're driving these cars. Emphasis on the word feel, by the way. I'll talk about it more deeply later when I get into physics, but for now, the sound design in these cars in particular, they're just amazing. Here, have a listen and you'll see what I mean with feeling immersed. The roaring of the engine, the suspension hanging on, the wind blowing past you, and the cars driving past you as well. Simbin games always have this unnatural talent of sounding amazing. GTR2 is 17 years old at this day and age, and it still has genuinely better sounds than a lot of games that come out nowadays. And by the way, this also applies to the mods this game has, because yes, don't forget, you can mod this game too. And there's a lot of good mods for this game which also share all of the same praises as the base game cars, sometimes even being better than them. The thing I like the most about the mods you can get for this game is that you have games like Assetto Corsa, right? If you're talking about mods, you can't not talk about Assetto Corsa. Assetto Corsa has some very good mods, some of the best I've genuinely seen. But I feel like GTR2 has more good mods, if that makes sense. And they're easier to find too. Like, I feel like you really have to scroll past a lot of, and excuse the term here, shit, to find a good mod in Assetto Corsa. For every sol, there's like 50 Facebook drift group levels of quality mods in Assetto Corsa. Whereas in GTR2, I didn't really get that feeling. Like, first of all, it's a 17-year-old game. I haven't found a single paid mod for this game. But anyways, there's also just a lot of very solid mods out there for this game. I only really recall finding one or two real stinkers for it, and it mostly had to do with the fact that these mods were just severely outdated since they had been posted many and many years ago, and had gained a few bugs as time went by. Some of the most notable mods for this game are, of course, Power and Glory when it comes to adding new content, but I'd be doing the mod dirty if I just said that's all it did. Power and Glory is a complete overhaul of GTR2, and I don't have time to talk about it here right now. If you want to hear someone talk about it though, I highly recommend watching GP Labs' video on it. I admit I don't really watch that many racing YouTubers frequently, much less go out of my way to recommend them on my channel, but I have a feeling if you like this video and a couple of other similar videos I've done, you'll love his channel, so go check it out. Another mod which I actually found out about watching GP Labs' video is Crew Chief. Now, if you're familiar with sim racing, then you're familiar with Crew Chief and might be finding it a bit weird that I'm including it here. Crew Chief, aside from its universal feature common to all games, where it gives you a race engineer that talks to you and that you can talk to, also has a patch you can install that is specific to GTR2, which, in addition to some much needed performance improvements, adds things like flat spotting and also fixes that really weird bug that old games usually have, where sometimes stuff that's kind of far away looks sort of flickery. You might be able to notice it sometimes on this video because I use footage both with and without the Crew Chief patch. And lastly, when it comes to well-known mods for GTR2, there's also the high-quality GTR2 10th anniversary patch, which does a multitude of things to modernize the game, such as giving the cars and tracks new models and textures, new sounds, new force feedback, and also giving you things like a modern HUD and so on. Now, as I said, these are what I consider to be the 3 biggest GTR2 mods, but there's a bunch of other mods that do simpler things, like add car packs and or individual cars, tracks, new lighting, all that jazz. You can find them on the usual sites like Race Department, but my usual go-to for GTR2 mods is this German website called esportracing.de. I'll link it in my description. I found a lot of very high quality mods over here, and I definitely recommend having a look through the website. They've got all sorts of stuff, from old East German shitboxes to modern F1 cars, and it also seems like they've got some sort of quality control in regards to what ends up on the website, because out of the dozens of mods I've downloaded, I've only come across 1 or 2 stinkers, like I said. Now you're probably thinking something along the lines of, yeah, you know, Purple, this game, you know, has a lot of cars, we get it, but how do they drive? And I'm really glad you're asking that question. You've got your priorities straight. When you make a game that has a lot of cars, but they all, like, you know, feel like shit to drive, you end up with something quite shallow, you know, like Forza. Let's start with something that a specific audience might appreciate: controller support. Now, I have to admit, me personally, I've never tried playing this game with a controller. I'm purely going off of other people's words. But I did get enough confirmation from enough people to officially confirm this. This game is perfectly playable on a controller. One of the biggest issues with racing games nowadays, and I'm going to specifically talk about Assetto Corsa here, is that they're made with one control scheme in mind, and anything else is more of an afterthought. It's there if you need it, you know? Driving with a controller in Assetto Corsa is one of the worst racing game experiences I've ever been subjected to. And it's no secret that I'm not alone on this. It's really bad, to the point where you basically need a wheel. And before you write in the comments section, Purple, that's bullshit, I can post competitive times on Mount Akina and my A86 just fine. And all I had to do was play regularly for 500 hours with a controller, and spend 50 of those hours looking up configs and settings online. Just actually read what you're about to comment. A controller is not only very tedious and difficult to set up properly in Assetto Corsa, to the point of there being multiple threads about it online on how to do it, but even after you do, you always be extremely uncompetitive in comparison to a wheel user with the same amount of experience and playtime. It's bad. But with GTR2, that's somehow not the case. I don't know if this was a pure coincidence from the developers or not, but GTR2 is, as I said, perfectly playable on the controller. Let me give you this example, alright? This is a true story. There's this one guy on my Discord server. At the time, me and some other members there have been playing GTR2 for some time. All on our wheels, aside from one or two of us. This new guy, right? He asks us what we're playing and decides he'll join in. This dude's never played GTR2 before and has less playtime than a bunch of experienced wheel users. He rocks up to our next race in his controller and wins. Comfortably. He does this for a while. Eventually we get better and he goes from being dominant to just highly competitive. That's a just with quotation marks, by the way. He's still competing very hard for wins and getting them in a controller versus wheel users with more playtime. And before you think this is just a one-off fluke, it's happened more than once. Admittedly, they weren't always dominating or fighting for wins like this guy, since driver skill in itself plays a huge part in that too. But they were having no issues controlling their cars and fighting other players and the game's AI. Now obviously, before I get your hopes up with all of this is a simulator. Obviously the wheel will be better and is what the game is built around. So don't jump into the game with your controller expecting this to be Forza Horizon or Need for Speed, but you'll be very relieved to know at least that it's not Assetto Corsa. And speaking of things you'll be pleased to know, let's talk about wheels now. The force feedback in this game is really good, especially considering the game's age. Now before I praise it, I will get the bad things out of the way. There aren't that many of them anyways. This game, being as old as it is, came out in a time where 900-degree wheels were, let's just say, uncommon. They were just starting to get introduced to the market. Because of this, the game is hardwired to 540 total degrees of rotation for your steering wheel. To be honest, you're not really ever going to need to turn the wheel any more than that, considering the cars you're expected to be driving. But that restriction is still there and is something I feel I should warn you all about. Now for the other thing, and this is where you'll actually have to feel this issue, and that is the brakes. In this game, the brakes feel a little weird. This might just be me, but as vague as it sounds, that's as best as I can put it. Weird. It doesn't really give you that good of a feedback on how much pressure you can apply before locking up. Nor does it really give you that much feedback as to when you've locked up, to be completely honest. At least compared to other racing games, I feel like you have to be extra careful with your brakes here. But now let me tell you what this game does really well, making the car feel alive. When you drive in this game, it really does feel like you're in an actual rattly, shaking all over the place, getting thrown around by bumps, getting sucked into the ground by downforce race car. The one thing this game does way better than any other game, which you may have actually noticed just from watching, is suspension movement. In a lot of games, your car feels very static and floaty, and you don't really get a whole lot of force feedback as you're going at high speeds, even as the wind is hitting against your car through bumpy roads. In GTR2, it's the complete opposite. You can just feel the springs in your car compressing and decompressing as it goes over bumps and curbs. You can hear it too, by the way. My personal favorite part is that this also happens during braking and acceleration. This, combined with the game's incredible sound design, helps massively with immersion. And for that very reason, GTR2 is, to this day, one of my favorite games to play on the wheel, just because of the actual feeling of driving a car. So now that you know all about how it feels to drive a car in this game, how do the cars in this game actually feel to drive? That was a lot more confusing. I'm talking about the physics, okay? Well, for a driving game that's about 17 years old, the physics in GTR2 have also aged pretty well. Since it's a sim, it's very obviously leaning heavily towards the more realistic side, but what you'll find with the cars in this game in specific is that they're all a bit too grippy. I'm not really saying that as if it were a bad thing, mind you. Something being unrealistic isn't the same thing as it being bad, even when talking about sims. I personally quite like it, honestly, because you can push your cars very hard, and once they do start to slide or slip out, they're actually very easy to correct, especially in comparison to Assetto Corsa, where you have to react near instantly with some cars to not only feel the slide, but to catch it too. Here, you know when the car is about to completely lose grip, and you can very easily catch it and carry on your merry way after executing a sick-ass save. However, don't let this fool you into thinking you can just brainly mash the throttle, because if you do that at slow speeds, you will spin out. And when you spin out in this game, it's very hard to get going again. And if you spin out onto gravel or grass, you're gonna be stuck there for a while. Simbin have made it very hard to get out of gravel traps in particular, to the point where you might find yourself getting stuck in some of them. Like, actually stuck. You cannot get out. Your race is over. So be careful with any mistakes you make, because this game will punish you for it, as it should. Oh, and speaking of punishment, I nearly forgot to mention one thing, since I don't usually race with it on. But car damage and reliability is a thing in this game. If you're not careful, one crash might completely wreck your car, or your own reckless driving can make your engine or transmission blow. Don't be alarmed though, you're not the only one who can make mistakes. I mentioned earlier I do races in this game with people in my Discord server. They make a lot of mistakes, but the point of this segment isn't to throw shade at anyone. The point I'm trying to make is that not everybody has people to make mistakes with. In other words, not everyone has people to play with. And that's what the single player AI are for. GTR2 is an old game, and old games always have this thing where their AI is either really good or really bad. There's never an in-between. With GTR2, the AI is very good. It's difficult to explain why, but if you know what makes a racer fun to drive against, then you'll know what makes this AI good. They're fast, but they make mistakes, aggressive but not dirty, and will change their lines depending on whether they're trying to get by you or keep you from getting by them. In a broad sense, this is how the AI in this game behaves, but they do have some notable weaknesses. First of all, the quality of the base game AI is good, like I said, but you have to remember that this game has mods, those being cars and tracks, and sometimes the AI can't adapt themselves well to said mods. But this is not Simbin's fault, as the programming and quality of the AI usually depends on the creator of the mod in itself. The second weakness I noticed in the AI, and this time the issue is present on the base game, is that the AI sometimes struggle with getting past lapped cars. This is especially noticeable in multi-class races, such as in Spa, which in this game allows for a whopping 60 plus cars to be on track at the same time. Which also reminds me actually, if that last feature just made you cringe at the thought of your CPU and GPU exploding, GTR2 has this really neat feature on the menu, which allows you to change how many cars are visible at one given time, so that even if you have 60 cars on track, you can choose to only see the nearest 10 for instance. This is for those people who have weak computers, of course, which GTR2 is a perfect candidate for. Assetto Corsa isn't exactly the most demanding game when it comes to PC specs, but there are still people out there who simply don't have a good enough PC to run it. GTR2 is old. It has some of that old game jank that titles from around this time usually have. For instance, alt-tabbing is much akin to playing Russian roulette, only with the bullet being replaced with your entire PC freezing, so I'd highly advise against doing that while playing.
Play.
But the point I was making is that with the game being so old, you will definitely have no issues running it on any computer whatsoever. Although speaking of technical quirks this game has, I should actually mention a rather notable one. GTR2 is available for purchase on Steam for €6, which I actually can't believe I forgot to mention until now. It's dirt cheap. But anyways, the game's been out for a while, and in that meantime, it has unfortunately lost a few of its licenses, namely the licenses for Porsche and Ferrari. As such, if you play the Steam version of the game without making any alterations to it, you'll notice that Ferrari and Porsche are completely absent from the car selection. However, this can easily be fixed by downloading a patch for the game, which brings them back. There's several guides on how to do so online and on Steam in itself. There's also a guide on my Discord if you want to join that. I also think you can actually just get them back by default with the crew chief patch, so in the end it kind of ends up not really being an issue, since you easily fix it once and you're good to go. But it should still be noted that GTR2 isn't simply one of those games that you can just buy, install and play. It's a game that you buy, install, make a few alterations to it, and then play. And when I say easy, I really do mean easy. I know there's a lot of people that aren't very tech savvy. I'm a caveman when it comes to computers, alright, and I found it very easy. It's easy, trust me. If you're struggling, you can join my Discord server. I will personally help you out, and you'll get the game running very easily, like 10 minutes at most. And with that said, I don't think there's anything more to GTR2. It's an old sim racer, plain and simple. You boot up the game, select the car and track, and just go from there. You have a career mode, you even have a driving license school thing actually, kind of like Gran Turismo. And if you're not satisfied with the base game's content, you've got a wide variety of very good mods to pick from without having to browse through trash for hours. And so now we return to our initial question. Going off of all of this, what happened to GTR2? Why did it just get forgotten by time? Well, as clickbaity as it's going to sound after making you hear all of this, there's no 100% accurate pinpoint reason, and before you get the wrong idea by that, I mean there's no specific event or characteristic of the game that we can for sure attribute this to. But I do at least have a guess. A strong one at that. If you've been paying attention, you realize that most, if not all, of the negatives that I've talked about regarding this game are in one way or another related to how old it is. The graphics, the occasional jankiness of getting it to work, the installation quirks. So, as boring of a reason as it is, I think it just simply comes down to the game being old. Which shouldn't be a reason for any game to be forgotten, honestly. It's sad. Assetto Corsa is already 9 years old. People tend to forget that. That's almost a whole decade. If a new game came out which was similar to Assetto but not exactly the same, and by that I mean doing something's better but something's worse, would you immediately forget and discard AC just because it's old? Of course not. Assetto Corsa is a fantastic game. And the same can be said about GTR2, and any other older title, racing game or not actually. Aside from ongoing developer updates, games never change. And that's one thing that people don't seem to understand. If it was good back then, it'll still be good now. And even if it doesn't do some things as well as current titles, you might find that it does certain things better. Whether the trade-off is worth it or not is up to you, but with how racing games are turning out nowadays, with even trusted developers such as Polyphony Digital flopping pretty hard with Gran Turismo 7, I think you'd be a fool to ignore older games such as this. People have been complaining a lot about racing games recently, and with good reason. We haven't had many good releases at all recently, especially from AAA studios, and there isn't really anything to look forward to right now, which is making people lose hope on the racing genre. But honestly, who cares? Who cares? Why do you need to look forward to something? What are you expecting to get out of these new games, and why are you taking the risk of looking forward to something that's going to disappoint you? Is it because it's a new game? Well, what does the word new mean to you? Is it new because it's going to be released in the future? Or is it new because it's a game you haven't played yet? Because if it's the latter, well, I'm sure there's plenty of amazing games that you haven't played yet that you can look forward to playing. Only that to know about them, you have to start looking back at the racing game industry as a whole, not forwards towards the future. New doesn't equal good, it's not nostalgia. But with all of that said, if you just rather, sit in your chair, be miserable and complain about the state of racing games nowadays, that's fine too. It's none of my business. I'm sure Motorsport 8 will be great, I mean, Horizon 5 was shit. Motorsport 7 was shit. Horizon 4 was shit. But don't worry, I'm sure Forza Motorsport 8 will be just great, buddy. Anyways, I went off on a bit of a tangent there. That about wraps it up. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video and learning a thing or two about GTR2. Actually, did you even know of GTR2 at all before watching this video? If so, how did you learn of it? I'm curious to know just how popular or unpopular this game is among my viewer base. Now, to give a brief status update, I know it's been a very long time since I last uploaded, over a year in fact. The reason that happened was a mix of both college work and honestly laziness. My interests in that time had slowly been shifting away from racing game content, and so I found it a bit difficult to honestly gather the motivation to make videos on any racing game, and instead decided to just take a break and focus on my studies until that motivation came back. I'll admit that motivation isn't 100% back yet, but some of it is still there. You can expect more videos in the near future. In less than a year this time. Again, thank you all for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe. If you'd like to see me be alive more than once a year, feel free to join my Discord, link in the description. I talk and do races there. Peace.